Hello everybody, Gershon here with Ginger Security, and today we'll be showing you how we audited StarkSwap, one of the biggest, if not the biggest AMMs on StarkNet. So for that, I've got my StarkNet t-shirt here, I've got my crypto coffee mug, and I think we're ready to audit. So let me, first of all, exit this Loom screen and go over to where I do the coding stuff. Okay, so we've been asked by the StarkSwap team to audit their StarkSwap contracts repo, which you can find if you go to GitHub. Let me open it up for you. GitHub, StarkSwap contracts. And we've been tasked specifically with a commit beginning with CFEE, this one right over here. Okay, so I just so happen to have this git commit over here ready on my desktop, or not my desktop, on my machine. And let's fire up Visual Studio Code, and begin talking about this. So before we jump into any audit, what we have to consider is, what is this project? Sometimes a client might even tell us they're more concerned about a specific area of the code more than another. So we have to consider all of these things. For this one specifically, it's an AMM, pretty standard. For this specific audit, there wasn't a specific area that the client was more or less concerned about. Obviously, like with any audit, asset manipulation is the most severe, or anything that would allow an attacker to either grief, manipulate assets, or do any kind of denial of service attack, whether it's temporary or permanent. So there wasn't a specific area of the code. It was like the whole code that we were looking at. So when I dive into an audit, what I do is I simply read the code top to bottom, bottom to top. I read the docs. I talk to the team. Coming originally from Web 2 security background, this is one thing I do very much like about smart contract auditing, is that the code is, even if it's a huge project, the code base is usually quite small. So in this video, I won't actually show you line by line, like how I looked at the code and the kind of notes that I took. I would very much encourage you, if you're somebody trying to get into security auditing, or you're already a security auditor, but maybe you're trying to get into StarkNet. Specifically, again, this is a StarkNet project, different language. We'll talk about that in a bit. I would encourage you to open up maybe the same repo, maybe even the same commit, and just try to follow along. But again, I won't get into specifics. I'll just tell you generally what I did, and you can do it yourself. Pause the video if you need to, do it yourself if you want. So specifically for the sake of this video, I'm gonna dive into what is the most important contract in this project, which is the pair contract, okay? So as you can see, Cairo, very different language than Solidity, which most of you are familiar with. In addition, this is an older version of Cairo. So as you can see, the comments here are with a hashtag instead of a // So even Visual Studio is not rendering this correctly, but this is the code we were given, and this is the code we have to work with. So let's say we're reading this contract. Again, we're going to be reading everything top to bottom, bottom to top a couple of times. The goal is to get as familiar with the code as somebody on the StarkSwap team is. So let's say I'm reading this code, I'm reading this code. So what I would do is, again, read it top to bottom, first of all. And let's say there's something that I'm not sure about, or a line of code that either like seems a little suspicious to me, I don't understand why they did something there, I'm asking myself a question. So what I would do, I would use one of 4 tags, okay? And so I would actually do a comment, either a // as it is in the current Cairo version, or a hashtag as it was in the older one. And then I would do @audit, okay? Audit means that's like a note that I take for myself as the auditor. There's 4 tags that I personally use, and I would recommend you do as well. There's audit, there's audit audit info, there's audit OK, and audit issue. And you can see that Visual Studio Code, if you download an extension by the name of I think it's called Solidity Visual Developer. We'll definitely link to it in the description below. You'll get Visual Studio Code to create those little tabs on the left-hand side for you. Okay, so what I would do, I would go line by line. If I have a question for myself, I would write audit. This line seems suspicious. Is an overflow possible here? For example, okay? If it's something that is not a question that so audit would be for questions that I'm asking myself. If it would not be a question that I'm asking myself, and just like something perhaps I think the team did not do a good enough job of documenting something, and I want to document it for my own purposes in my own language, okay? I would do an audit info. This is a swap from token A to token B. The fee is taken before the function is called. For example, so this is audit and audit info, all right? So what I would do is I would try to answer all of my questions. I would go over the code 5 times if needed, look at the docs, whatever, to make sure that everything I have is either an audit info, or if it was an audit, that I've answered it. Once I've answered it, it becomes audit OK. For example, if I see that, for example, a line was suspicious and I thought an overflow was possible, but then I figure out, I read the docs and I see that an overflow is indeed possible, but is desired, as is sometimes the case, I would write audit OK. I would convert the comment to an audit OK. Okay, and then I would write the reason why it's OK now. An overflow is desired here. See link, and then I would paste the link here. Paste link here. Okay. So after I've read the code a couple of times, I would get to a point where I either answered all of my audit tags, or I've gotten a really good understanding of the code, okay, as it is. And now maybe I'm ready to do a deeper dive into my audits that I was not able to answer. For those of you curious, once I, for example, figure out that an audit issue that I thought was possible is indeed an issue, I would mark it as audit issue, obviously. All right, so enough with general statements. Let's consider StarkSwap specifically. So if you were following along offline and actually reading the code, you would soon discover that this code is almost an exact copy of Uniswap v2. As many projects are, they're simply forks of similar well-known projects onto a different chain. This case, in my opinion, is particularly interesting because it's a fork, but in a different language on a completely different platform, that platform being StarkNet. So I think what would be important right now is for us to compare, okay? Because Uniswap is very battle tested. It's it's dealt over $1 trillion in swaps. Okay, last time I checked on Dune Analytics. So it's very battle tested. If we see that the functionality is one-to-one the same as Uniswap is, and of course that's not an easy task, we can be we can assume that it's pretty safe. So next thing on the list, after we've considered the code, we've read it line by line, maybe we have a few possible leads for issues. Next thing to do would be to open up Uniswap v2. I just so happen to have it here downloaded as well, so let's open up Visual Studio Code for it. And again, if you want to, pause the video, try to do the same as I'm doing here. If you were to go over the Uniswap code, and there's a lot of guides online that explain it very well, you would see that the structure is very, very similar. Just like we have a pair contract, a StarkSwap v1 pair.cairo, there is a Uniswap v2 pair, which is the contract, again, responsible for pair vaults. It is in and of itself an ERC20. It's got to give you a LP token, and it manages the swaps from token A to token B. So next thing I would do, and that we actually did, would be to go function by function, okay, contract by contract, line by line, and see where the differences are, okay? In order to show you a more concrete example, let me show you we forked the GitHub repo for StarkSwap where we had our actual comments. So let me show you the comments that we actually had during our audit. So I'll fire up another Visual Studio Code window over here. And as you can see, there's a ton of those. Here again, we're on StarkSwap v1 pair. There are a ton of those. There's audits, there's audit infos, stuff, notes that I took down for myself. Everything that was one-to-one, as with Uniswap, I actually linked either to the Uniswap docs or to the actual Uniswap repo. I don't think you can see it over here, but in other areas of the code, there are links, as there is over here, to the actual Uniswap repo, which when I actually went over the code, helped me understand the code better and also see where the differences may lie. Because again, this is a fork. If it's one-to-one functionality-wise, not code-wise, functionality-wise, and I'll get to the difference in a bit. If it's one-to-one functionality-wise, as with Uniswap v2, then it should be safe. So let's recap what we did so far. We looked at the code, we understood it very well. We looked at the Uniswap code, and we understood that very well too. And right now we have a lot of notes. We have a good understanding of the StarkSwap code. We have a good understanding of the Uniswap code. So the next step, in my opinion, would be to have a very good understanding of StarkNet itself. Now, why is that? So a minute ago, I mentioned that there is a difference between functionality and code. The code might be exactly the same, especially when you're talking about a fork that is on an EVM chain. For example, if the StarkSwap team, instead of doing an AMM on StarkNet, they did it on Polygon, for example, which of course is a EVM chain. Maybe the code would have been one-to-one the same as Uniswap. Does that mean that functionality-wise it's the same? Not necessarily. So every chain, even if it's EVM, might have certain functions that it implements a little bit differently. Specifically, Polygon, for example, has callbacks on native tokens. If I transfer a native token on Polygon, it would allow me to do a callback. We've seen this in the wild. This has been an attack vector, okay, for for projects that simply forked an existing project onto a new chain. So even in such similar chains as Polygon and Ethereum, there are differences even for identical code. So for StarkNet, it's going to be even more different. So here at Ginger Security, we've dealt with StarkNet from day one. StarkNet is our bread and butter. But let's say you're newer to StarkNet, you want to know where to start. Let's say you're considering a fork on a different chain. So what I would do first and foremost is try to Google things that are specific to the chain you're trying to audit. So there is a very good resource for StarkNet specifically, and I'm going to open it up over here. There's this Cairo and StarkNet Security guide written by a fellow named Control C03. I'm sure that's not his real name. I'm sure that's just a nickname. So also, when I do an audit, even though like we already have more of a acquaintance with and more experience with StarkNet and applications on StarkNet, I go over this myself as well. So the next thing on the list after we've looked at the code, looked at the Uniswap code, is to look at StarkNet specific security measures and issues, and anything really that is worthy of being in this guide. And again, this is just like one guide I pulled up. I can attest that this is a very good guide, and like I'd say the most comprehensive that I've seen on StarkNet. But again, like you got to do your research when you do an audit yourself. So again, I'm not going to go one by one over here because there's a lot of things to cover. But what I would say is interesting about StarkNet is that it's got or Cairo VM, is that it's got a very different memory model. It's got what they call a read-only or read-once memory model, which I will not explain over here. It's better that you look at a guide. And it's completely different than what you have on EVM. Also, on EVM, you natively support things like uint 256. On StarkNet, that's not natively supported. So the next step would be to go over this, understand all of it, go back to your notes, go again line by line, see if there is anything that is applicable to what you've read over here. Again, to recap, we did 3 things so far, that being 1, we looked at the code. 2, we looked at the Uniswap code and compared. 3, we studied StarkNet and looked at the code again. Okay, we've done 3 things. By now, I would say we should be StarkSwap experts. And now onto the 4th part. The 4th part being, in my opinion, the fun part. The 4th part is the one in which we're going to go bug hunting. Okay, with every project that you ever try to audit, there is quite a steep learning curve depending on the size of the project and how familiar you are with the concepts being introduced. But after some time of getting familiar with the platform and with the code, you get to a point where you really feel as if you were a part of the team and that you really understand the code very well. So after we've done these 3 things, we should be at this level. So the next thing would be to look at all of our audit comments and see if we can actually exploit them. Okay, so specifically with StarkSwap, I'll show you a couple. You can look at our report and see like also the more serious issues that we found or the less serious issues that we found. But I'm gonna focus on one issue that we did find because I think it's an interesting case study. So in StarkNet, they did have a problem with the uint 256s. Okay, we've also written an article about this at Ginger Security. Let me show you that article because it's got a good It's got a good diagram over there. So as I mentioned before, StarkNet does not support uint 256s natively. Instead, it has a native support for a integer-sized 252. Okay, the native integer, or not specifically integer, but the native size in StarkNet is 248 bits long, which is a very strange number. I have not seen. There is a reason for it. If you're reading to StarkNet, as you should, if you want to audit, it's got something to do with the architecture. Again, we're not going to get into this here, but the native size is 248, which of course a uint 256 has more bits than 248. So what they did at StarkNet is they have a uint 256 struct, which has a low 248 bits and has a high 248 bits, totaling 496 bits. Okay, so they use 496 bits, okay, to represent 256. Okay, so by the way, this 248 integer on StarkNet is called a felt. You can see that over here. Felt. By the way, an article that I very much recommend reading if you want to understand like the deeper issue here. It will also be linked, of course. So what happens is that for each such felt, there's two felts in the struct. For each such felt, there's 124 bits that are junk, okay? And they can be manipulated. They can be manipulated to cause some issues. This was a big issue within StarkNet, which was later fixed. Okay, so right now this is not something that is applicable to the best of my knowledge to any, with a new version, with Cairo 1.0, this is not applicable to any StarkNet application, but at the time it was. So one thing that we did is we looked over every place where the StarkSwap team used a uint 256, and we tried to see if the exploit mentioned over here is applicable to their code. And indeed, we found a couple of places where it was applicable, and we got a medium severity vulnerability from it. It was resolved it was resolved very quickly. The StarkSwap team was very responsive and very understanding, and it was not anything that would lead to to loss of funds as far as we're concerned. It did require like a few other things to go wrong in order for it to lead to a loss of funds, but this is for educational purposes how we were able to find this specific vulnerability. So this about concludes this tutorial. Again, if anybody has specific questions, you're welcome to write it in the comments below, DM us either on Twitter or via email or wherever, Pigeon, whatever you guys prefer. If you have any specific questions, we're all about education. If you want to learn from this case study, we would be happy to help. And yeah, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and hoping to see you in the next one.